Hey everyone, welcome to session 278 of Behavioral Observations. In this episode, many-time guest Dr. Jim Moore stopped by to talk about a range of topics he's been working on since his last appearance. In particular, we talked about his recent move to Arizona and his new job at Therapy Matters. We talked about what he's learned as a C-suite executive who, by the way, maintains an active client caseload. We talk about the value of implementing universal behavioral protocols clinic-wide. Talk about practical approaches to thinking about the concept of Assent and what he's learned as of late implementing concepts and practices in the area of naming and the associated benefits he's seen in his clients from these strategies. And I really think that's probably one of the most interesting parts of this conversation. I mean, we touched on a lot of good stuff, but I really enjoyed that part of the conversation. That comes towards the end, so you're going to want to listen all the way through. If you like what you hear from Jim, he expands on, I think, pretty much all of these topics at the upcoming Stone Soup Conference. That's going down on October 25th, but it is recorded. It's an online conference for those who are not familiar with it, so it's exclusively online. And yeah, so you can watch it live and participate in the chat and do all the things, or you can watch it later. It's all through the magic of Behavior Live, and all the proceeds go to providing ABA services to children. So it's a really great event, fantastic speakers, and an amazing price. And if you want the price to be even more amazing, use the promo code podcast24 when you check out. So you can go to Behavior Live and just look up Stone Soup, or you can go to the show notes for this episode, and I'll have a link waiting there for you. And while we're talking about links, I do want to let you know that we did mention many, many resources during this show. So yeah, go to the show notes, whether you're signing up for the Stone Soup Conference or not, because I've got a lot of the things that we've talked about in this episode linked there. And the show notes are, I've gotten some feedback from listeners saying how much they do value the show notes. Sometimes I wonder, I put a lot of effort into them, and sometimes I wonder, why am I doing this? Do people actually look at this? And it turns out that people actually do, and they get some value out of it. So if you haven't stopped by Behavioral Observations to check out the show notes, do me a favor, go check them out. And if you want the show notes delivered directly to your email inbox with no spam or anything like that, sign up for the email list while you're over at the website. It's really easy, and the show notes just come to you. All right, I'm going to try to keep these opening remarks brief. The only thing else I want to mention before we get to the interview is that, again, go to Behavior Live, look up Stone Soup, and use the promo code podcast24. Also, we're brought to you by thebehavioraltoolbox.com. We are so close to releasing our latest course. When I say our, it's like the royal we, of course. It's Anika Costa and Dr. Polly Gavoni, my two partners at crime over at the Behavioral Toolbox. We've got a new course coming out on motivational interviewing. We've gotten some early feedback on it, and our beta testers really, really enjoyed it. So go check it out over at thebehavioraltoolbox.com/courses. We're also brought to you by CEUs from yours truly over at Behavioral Observations. So if you want to learn while you're multitasking, on your commute, while you're walking the dog, doing the dishes, going to the gym or whatever, go to behavioralobservations.com/get CEUs and check out the over 60 events that we have there. I've been adding new ones. So if you've been a previous customer, come visit again and see what new stuff we have to offer. And then last but not least, we are brought to you by the University of Cincinnati Online. They've designed an online Masters of Education program in behavior analysis. It's 100% online and asynchronous, meaning log on when it works for you. If you want to learn more, go to online.uc.edu and click the request info button. All right, that's it for opening remarks. Let's get to this fun conversation with Dr. Jim Moore.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Dr. Jim Moore, welcome back to Behavioral Observations. It's been a little bit, and it's fun to talk to you again.
Hey, Matt, it's always a pleasure to come on, and thanks for having me again.
All right, so we've got a little bit to catch up on. Last time we talked, we had concluded the Apollo podcast series, and since then, you've had quite a few changes in your life, including a move across the country and a new gig and things like that. So why don't you open this conversation up and just give us a little update on what's new with Jim?
Well, my wife and I and our small little horde of children have moved cross country. We now live just outside of Phoenix, Arizona, in a town called Chandler. And I'm the chief clinical officer for an agency out here called Therapy Matters. And it was a beautiful opportunity. It has Therapy Matters has integrated services, ABA, speech, OT, physical therapy, all under one roof. So it's really nice to have that collaboration and to also not have your clients on the road going to related services and things like that. The weather is so much more conducive to the joints and getting up in the morning. It's very dry here and not very cold. And I just really loved the mission when I met my CEO Jonathan Elowitz. His late wife started Therapy Matters to serve mainly out on the reservation here in Chandler, but also in other rural areas. She was an occupational therapist and really grew Therapy Matters about 20 years ago. She passed away unexpectedly, and Jonathan has kept Therapy Matters going as a tribute to her memory and her vision of serving children with autism and other developmental disabilities. And since then, it's grown and added those related services. And the ABA component was added a little over 3 years ago. And it just seemed like a great opportunity. My wife and I had kind of dreamt on our bucket list about living out in this part of the country. And so we took advantage of it.
Oh, good for you. That's really exciting. So I think one of the things that since the several years that I've gotten to know you, that you've had a couple of opportunities to start some clinical programs from scratch. And I'm curious, I want to get into, I have some very specific questions about doing this, but I'm just curious in a general sense, if there's any kind of lessons that you've learned having to all right, well, I guess I'm doing this again. And, so could you give us a perspective of coming into a program and either starting it from the ground up or coming into it early on in the process of an agency developing their personality or whatever? Yeah. Talk to us about that.
That's exactly right. I've learned, this is my 27th year in behavior analysis, which is hard to believe. So I've kind of seen the rise of the insurance mandates and the evolution of our CPT codes and how we've all scrambled to figure out how to build viable businesses that provide outstanding services. And what I've learned is every agency is different. They have their own culture, their own identity, their own values that they aspire to. And so here at Therapy Matters, it really was impressed upon me that they needed to see that they were not nearly as impressed with all the accolades that comes with Dr. James Moore. They wanted to see me in action and see that I knew what I was talking about. So I elected to take on a caseload. I have 8 clients, about 8 RBTs right now. That is a temporary situation, but it's been so refreshing to, instead of being kind of the engineer and almost the man behind the curtain for a lot of things, to actually have a caseload for them to see the progress. I've been able to start clients from day one, from assessment to the first day of admission. And I think that was unique to the culture here. They have a really strong core group of about 6 RBTs that have all been here since the start, which, as you know, with our RBT data, an RBT for 3 or more years starts to look like a unicorn because the turnover is so high at that credential level right now. And we actually have one RBT that has been with Therapy Matters since they opened the ABA services, but was an RBT for 4 years before that. So she's been an RBT almost as long as the credential has been in existence. And so they really had while they were small and they're looking to grow and build and really improve what they're doing, they already had a really strong culture and core group in place here, which is different than some of my previous experiences where I'm walking in almost from day one. And so I did, and I still do, I manage a caseload every single day. And I didn't realize how important that was for someone in an executive position in an ABA service providing company to do that, at least do some of that, to and as much for them as for me to, number one, show, hey, we talk about the demands on BCBAs, we talk about the need for mentorship, we talk about how stressful the job is, but it's been really refreshing to see that, hey, yes, I still can do that day-to-day case management job and do it really well. So it's been very meaningful for me, and so far from what I can tell here in Chandler, it's been really great for the team too. People are really excited. We're implementing some brand new things that I'm doing for the first time in my career, some kind of bringing together of some methodologies, and the most important thing is the outcomes that we're seeing from the clients.
Hey everyone, as a BCBA, meeting your continuing ed needs can be challenging at times. That's why I have made selected episodes of the Behavioral Observations podcast available for Type 2 continuing education credits. That's right. You can meet a portion of your professional development requirements on the go. Currently, we have CEs for topics including functional assessment, ethics, and supervision. Come learn from podcast favorites such as Greg Hanley, Pat Fryman, Mark Dixon, as well as many other amazing guests. For more information, head on over to behavioralobservations.com/get-CEs. Okay, so you have successfully set the table for a couple of things I definitely want to get into here. So, working with that, I have a lot of colleagues who are either clinic directors, agency owners, things like that, and they are not doing direct services because they're busy running their practice, doing the clinical director stuff, and all the things that kind of C-suite and owners, director level folks do, and as you just described, you've got an active caseload. And it's not just like, hey, I'm going to sit in the chair here for a little bit and try to work something out. You're working with clients on a day-to-day basis, which is again definitely unusual for someone in your position. So I know you kind of perhaps with some humility glossed over that a little bit, but like, is there something that you would like folks who've been out of the seat for a while to know about this experience of having to not having to, but getting the opportunity to see the perspective of a line level BCBA, if you will, providing those day-to-day services? Can you get into that in a little bit more detail?
Absolutely. I think the biggest thing that was really eye-opening to me is, when you get up to the executive level, you're doing a lot of work on processes, policies. You're trying to set up mentorship systems. You're setting up your KPIs, looking at the performance of your team. But until you've actually got into the trench and used those processes and actually implemented them yourselves, you can't fully understand some of the pain points that your team brings to you when they say, hey, I'm not going to get this report done on time. I don't have this done on time. I'm trying to get this done. And then the biggest thing that I've always preached since I've been in leadership positions is, hey, why are you taking so much work home with you? And so to get on the front lines and see, wow, these templates that we've built in our electronic medical record really don't work the way we thought they do. They're not as efficient. They're not saving the time. And by doing it, by being a user and not just a designer, now I can see, okay, here, I've every day I seem to find something in some of the templates that we use for BCBA notes. I'm like, okay, wow, no wonder they're having to write a novel in this section, because I've not given them a simple checkbox that can help really let this process go a lot faster. I'm not given the right prompts as to when to sync data when you're on the technician level. We've not built that into our training system. So it's, I feel like I came here already having developed a really strong training methodology, for example, for new technicians. But now there's so much of the pragmatic doing the job from 8 to 5 that now I see, okay, here's some gaps in our system. Here's some things that need to be improved. And because I still also wear that executive hat, that gives me a voice on that leadership team to say, hey, here's what I'm seeing on the floor day to day, not just a couple hours in this clinic, a couple hours in this clinic, meet with these BCBAs, but doing it 8 to 9 hours a day has been really, really good to help us because what I really love about Jonathan, our CEO, is of course he wants to grow. He wants to have a bigger impact on more lives, but he wants to do it in the right way, not just clinical excellence, but across the whole spectrum: administrative excellence, operational excellence, HR excellence. So it's really been helpful before we start to kick it into overdrive in terms of now let's start to grow. It's been so great to be on the front lines and see, okay, here's the easy things we can fix. Okay, and now here's some of the bigger lifts that we need to do, but now I have much clearer direction rather than getting it second and third hand. I've been a user of these things. And so I understand it really helps me facilitate change because on top of that case management duties, I still function as chief clinical officer. So there's a lot of strategy meetings, leadership meetings I have to go to, mentorship, and I really feel like I felt like I was a really strong mentor before I came to Therapy Matters, but this experience for the last few months has really, because to be quite honest, my service provision when I was a direct service provider and a direct BCBA predated this environment with CPT codes and comprehensive versus focused treatment. And so doing it has been very, very refreshing and eye-opening for me.
Awesome. That I'm sure the team is grateful for having both of those perspectives. I want to bring up another thing that you and I have talked about in the past. And I sometimes see this question come up either on Facebook or sometimes people will ping me randomly. And I know in one of our previous conversations, we had talked about putting together universal behavioral protocols in the various settings that you've worked in. And in doing so, you've been able to reduce the number of specific behavioral interventions, FAs, et cetera, that the teams have had to do, and therefore allowing them more time to spend on teaching new skills as opposed to fussing around with trying to reduce, tantrums, aggressive behavior, et cetera. And so people are like, what was that episode? And I have to go back and kind of go through the various, the numerous episodes. I think you've probably been the most frequent guest we've had on the podcast. And so just for those who might have missed that episode, missed that content, can you give us the Reader's Digest version of how you put together these kind of universal behavioral protocols and just so folks can get an idea of how they might conceptualize this in their setting?
Sure. Well, it all started with I was overseeing some services for a nonprofit in Mississippi some years ago, and I wanted to get better data on caregiver behavior at the initial assessment and the assessments, so on and so forth. So we started taking all of these data, and I had been trained in my graduate program on specific things. We called it time in, some call it rapport building, effective instruction delivery. What do you do when the child's inappropriate? And so I started measuring parent behavior on those things. And what I really saw was, especially with delivering instructions, that parents really didn't have any training and were going about delivering instructions to their children in a way that that we knew would cause problems. Mostly, we were not seeing the establishment of strong stimulus control around child compliance, around orienting when their parents would say either their name or look. And then we also saw that parents were kind of entangled in this sick social cycle where they were directly reinforcing, not purposely, but directly reinforcing problem behavior because it was delivering negative reinforcement in the form of escape or avoidance of their child's behavior. And so at that same time, I struck up a friendship with Megan DeLeon, and I was talking with her about these things. And she goes, Robert Schramm has this book that he gives to parents about instructional control. And so I got a copy of that book, and sure enough, it was almost verbatim kind of how I was taught to manage general behavior. And so then I started looking more broadly at, well, what are we telling our techs to do? And so much of RBT training at the time, and I still see this, is so narrow and specific on here are the clients you're going to work with. So here are the things you need to know about their behaviors. And that really makes it difficult to grow. It makes it difficult. Like if that staff member calls out and they've been trained, and now I don't have anybody who's been trained on this child. And so I really thought to myself, this is, and I also had a background in positive behavior support back during my time with the May Institute. And one of the first things you would do is put these tier one interventions or these universal protocols in place. So I developed a training first for technicians around Robert's 7 steps of instructional control with some of the things, there's one about schedule of reinforcement. They just need to know to follow that. But really, we wanted to get them good at controlling their environment, which is control access, unearned access to reinforcement, do a better job let's not even call it pairing anymore, building rapport and relationship, having fun with the child, making sure you're in tune to, are they motivated to work for you? Third, delivering instructions in an effective manner, using PREMAC principle effectively, and then creating contrast in your behavior when the child is inappropriate. I've really kind of come to a point where in my career after so long, and I think I even said on this episode that you're referring to that I'd seen Tim Vollmer speak recently. This has been years ago now at FABA. And he had found that in his lab, if they were able to achieve 95% integrity on an extinction protocol, it still produced a schedule rich enough to maintain behavior. And so I started to think about, okay, I went back to all those years of collecting parent data when I was in Mississippi, and I'm like, parents just aren't equipped to do extinction, and to a large extent, it's likely unfair to even ask them to.
Oh yeah.
But if I can somehow create contrast, I call it in our clinics extinction-esque. If I can really ramp up, because what we see at intake is the parents have the contingencies mixed up. They're over attending to problem behavior and under attending to appropriate behavior. Appropriate behavior is usually there, oh my gosh, I get a little bit of a break. And then the quality is often lacking. So we work with them with so we start with our technicians, and even technicians really struggle with that second step, that rapport building step, and tailoring their attention to what the child finds motivating. And so, yeah, when I can the better I can get at step 2, the better I can deliver my attention, whether it's verbal, physical, playing with toys, the more enriched I can deliver that, and the more consistently correctly I can deliver that, the more grace I get for however I feel like I may need to attend. Because you think about it, is a parent going to be able to always ignore their child? No. I live with 2 children with autism, and I tell you, I can't do it. I can do it a pretty long time, but that's, as you know, that might actually be worse than just immediately
totally
responding.
Yeah, absolutely.
What if your child flops in the road? You can't just ignore that. You have to act. And so really building up this history of, hey, I know you like attention, or I know you like these things, but let's get you the really good stuff. And so building that consistently, what we start to see is we get stimulus control around appropriate behavior. We get stimulus control around instruction following. And then we're able to then deliver this same methodology to the parents, which gives them some very much needed quick wins and immediate change in their daily quality of life that they're looking for, much more than, oh, hey, let me teach you this manned protocol or this toileting protocol. Though we may have to do those things, I think it's really important to, hey, let's clear the deck of all these behaviors that we really don't have to deal with. If, I had a parent the other day tell me, I was asking her how things were going, and she said, I can't believe how different it is. And I said, well, what do you attribute that to? She goes, I attributed it to, I had to change my mindset. I thought about what you told me about the social cycle, and you gave me examples, and I could see examples of how that was true for me. And I just had to accept it and decide to do something different. Also, in the meantime, her child has started to talk, which is always a great thing on top of that. But yeah, I think that with the universal protocol, what we knew from positive behavior support is that should deal with up to 85% of your problems, because most of your problems are kids being kids. They get a little too wound up, they get a little too silly, they get a little too impulsive. And if you have good structure in place, good boundaries, most of the time it doesn't really escalate. And it also then frees up more resources for that, 5 to 15% who do need more intensive assessment and intervention, so that you're not doing it for so many children.
Regardless of your title, if you are a behavior consultant who is working in or with schools and you are struggling and wondering why your interventions are not producing the desired results, you are not alone. Unfortunately, those tasked with improving behavior in schools are too often left to carry the burden by themselves. You are the behavior person, so you take care of it, is the unsaid mantra. But you can't improve behavior and the associated outcomes by yourself. In fact, creating sustainable improvement in student behavior almost always requires changes in the performance of the educators. I'm Dr. Pauly, and along with my colleagues Anika Costa and Matt Sikoria, we are designing coursework called the Behavioral Toolbox. In it, you will be taught strategies grounded in organizational behavior management for consulting in schools in a way that brings out the best in educators so they can bring out the best in the students they serve. If this sounds exciting, be sure to click on the link in the description to sign up for more information.
I see. There's a lot to take in there, but I think that gives people a good starting place, and I appreciate you going over that. And boy, I'm sure there's a lot of folks who are tuning in. We're like, hey, I'd love to, have a universal protocol in place that deals with, 80 to 85% of the challenging behaviors we're seeing here in the clinic. So,
well, and this
on that.
For any of the listeners, I will be talking about this as part of a larger Assent-based treatment talk that I'll be doing for the Stone Soup Conference. So if folks are really interested about hearing more and seeing some visuals with PowerPoint and all of that, and some data, I'll be showing some data as well, because I think in that debate about Assent-based treatment, in the center of it is how well have you established rapport and relationship with the client, and how motivated, like what reason have you given them to work for you? And so I'll be, if folks are interested, check out the Stone Soup Conference coming up pretty soon.
Yeah, it's next week. And also, I just want to let folks know, if you go to Behavior Live and just search Stone Soup, it'll be there. And I think Behavior Live is kind of like best in class in terms of the online conference, portal experience. I've done a lot of work with those guys, and they do a really good job. And it is Friday, I believe, October 25th. But if you're busy that day, the conference is available because it's online, and through the magic of Behavior Live, I think it'll be available for at least a month afterwards. And so if you want to learn more, just go to the show notes of this episode. I'll have a link waiting for folks there. And while you're there, be sure to use the promo code podcast24 to save on your registration. For those who don't know, the Stone Soup Conference is a great event, and it goes to funding actual therapy for individuals who are receiving autism services. So it's a great event with great speakers like yourselves and many others, all for a great cause. So, Jim, you were very smooth in transitioning to that, because I was going to ask you, what were you talking about next? And I believe you're going to, so without giving it away, because we definitely want people to go to the Stone Soup Conference and sign up and support this really worthy cause. But can you dangle a few more things out in front of us in terms of, because I know you're going to be giving some kind of what I would consider practical remarks about the concept of Assent. It's a topic, obviously, that's coming up every conference everyone goes to. And so, yeah, give us a sense about what you're talking about, but not so much that people don't want to tune into the real thing.
Give a little teaser.
Yeah.
Right? Well, I was surprised when Karen reached out to me and asked me to speak about this particular topic. I do have background in it, as folks who followed the podcast know. I'm kind of becoming a dinosaur in our field. And when I went through graduate school back in those days, if you really wanted to work in behavior analysis, you had to get a PhD in psychology. So I had whole courses where we talked about consent, assent, mainly from a research standpoint, but also to a lesser extent, from a clinical practice standpoint. But I think, and so as with a lot of things in our field, there's kind of been sides drawn. And it's like, oh no, this is going to be the death of behavior analysis. How are we supposed to get anything done if we're allowing the child just to say no all the time? And then you have the other side saying, no, we have to have, we have an ethical obligation to humane treatment and, client dignity and respect, which are obviously important things. But then the question comes up, but hey, back to what these folks were saying, how do you get them to work? And really, from my vantage point, when I was asked to speak about this, I really looked at our literature, and shout out to Cody Morris, who's probably contributed most of the work in this area, a couple of articles in JABA and some other places. I really felt like maybe we're looking at this issue wrong. I know Greg Hanley has said for quite some time now, hey, if you wouldn't want your services broadcast on TV, you're probably doing something wrong. And so I think the issue comes down to, are we coercing learners into engaging in work trials? It's necessary. They need to do these things. But is the way we're going about it, and are all the points of pressure that mainly young BCBAs feel with this massive treatment plan, client starting on Monday, and oh my gosh, we've got to start doing trials by Monday afternoon or Tuesday at the latest. Are we looking at this issue wrong? Is that it's not the Pandora's box of Assent that we should be talking about, but hey, how are we doing in motivating this learner? How are we building rapport and relationship? I mean, many times these are small children who many times are not speaking when they come into treatment. This is often the first time they've been separated from their caregivers, and they're often being separated for long periods of time. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about universal protocols that we just talked about and some other things that I've seen that really help us, and everywhere I've been, not have to really think about this as an issue. If I don't want children to have bad experiences in ABA therapy, and I don't want families to have bad experiences. I came into behavior analysis because I was led to believe it could save the world, and I'm still naive's not the word I'm looking for, but I'm still idealistic enough to believe that that could be the case. So I think it's what are we doing in the clinic? What are we doing with the learner? What are we asking them to do? How are we trying to motivate them? How are we getting them to value a relationship with us and our attention? I remember I had a Von Barnes Holmes come in to a team I was leading and do some trainings a few years ago. And I remember her saying, if you've not built a relationship with the client and they have severe language deficits and you deliver praise to them, how do they know that you're praising them, and how do they know what it is you're praising them for? And I think that so I'm going to take kind of that take on it and say, hey, instead of attacking each other, which we're really good at in behavior analysis, saying you're right and you're wrong, or instead of pointing back out and say, no, that you're talking about the bad ABA, that's not what we do, and here's what good ABA looks like, to literally look in the mirror and say, hey, I may have all the best intentions in the world, but have I put procedures in place? Have I put trainings in place to make it more of a motivating environment and less of a And I know that word coercion, kind of smack people in the face, but you can definitely tell the difference from a motivated learner. And I think the challenge is that coercion works a large percentage of the time. You're in public schools every day. No one ever asks, why do most of these kids engage in appropriate behavior and do their work? No one ever asks that. And I think it's a combination of some reflexive condition motivating operations. Hey, I'm going to call your parents, so it can get much worse for them, or on-site coercion. But then you have your 5 to 10% of kids where they are going to fight you. They are going to die on that hill before they'll do what you ask them to do. And I think we have to step back and ask ourselves, is that the environment in which we want our clients making progress? No, I would much rather it be an environment that can produce happy, relaxed, and engaged learners. I think that what I'm going to talk about a lot is how do you do that?
Hey everyone, balancing work, personal life, and school can be challenging. And that's why the University of Cincinnati created a fully online Masters of Education in Behavior Analysis program. This asynchronous program is designed to accommodate your schedule with support from student success coordinators every step of the way. In just 5 semesters, you can graduate and be prepared for the BCBA exam. The University of Cincinnati's program is FAFSA eligible and offers tuition discounts to their unique business partnership program. If this sounds good to you, visit online.uc.edu/behavior-analysis-med to learn more, or you can simply go to the show notes for this episode to find a convenient link. So again, that's the Stone Soup Conference. Just go to the show notes of this episode. And again, remember to use the promo code podcast24 to save at your registration. All right. So you mentioned real quickly earlier on a kind of an epiphany that you've had. And those are my words. So you can change, if that's not the right way to think about it, let me know. But, and when we talked on the phone last week and planning this conversation, that you've been really getting into some interesting work here, and you've been implementing some newer strategies with regard to language instruction with the clients that you're working with. So, and as part of, I guess, some background reading that I did so I can kind of get up to speed, because most folks generally know, I don't do this type of work. But I'm interested in it. I'm interested to take the champ on it. So I read the paper that you shared with me from JAB by Sivaraman and Barnes Holmes, Greer, Feinup, and Royers. And it was kind of like just a lengthy discussion of verbal behavior development theory and relational frame theory. And I was kind of drawn to more so the first half of the article when they talked about some of the bidirectional naming strategies that they used. So I know you're playing around with a lot of these concepts. So tell us a little bit about how you decided to, test some of these things out. Give us some tangible things that you're doing. And of course, we want to hear how this is manifesting itself in terms of client outcomes.
Right. So, yeah. So as most people who've heard me speak know, for several years, I've incorporated features of relational frame theory and stimulus equivalence into early intervention treatment for children with autism. I've been using the peak assessment and curriculum since they've pretty much come out. I've published a couple of papers in that area. But the way I was trained in graduate school was to really lean into our attitude, as Skinner called them, of science, the one of philosophical doubt. And we were having tremendous outcomes, and everyone was excited. Everywhere I worked, parents, insurance companies, owners, they were all so excited to see this amazing progress. But that just wasn't enough for me. I wanted to understand. RFT has a rich and broad conceptual base to it, but I still felt like there's 2 things that were really sticking out to me. As one, because RFT has just only recently started to become embraced in early intervention, there's not a plethora of efficacy studies showing that, hey, here's how we tried to teach this hierarchical frame, and here's how we tried to teach a learner to auditorily discriminate between us saying put with same, put with different. And so we were figuring out these teaching methodologies kind of on the fly. And and most of them would work great, and some of them would leave us wanting with more questions. And then secondly, I just felt like, whether you call it deriving, arbitrarily applicable relational responding, bidirectional naming, X, Y, or Z, whatever you want to call it, there is private behavior that is verbal behavior that I really felt that was a mediator in what we were calling deriving and AARR. And I started going to many of my colleagues who are like-minded in RFT, and surprisingly got a lot of, well, what does it matter? What does it matter what else is going on? This stuff works. Why do you care? And I really kind of felt like in some circles that, wow, this is almost like a methodological behaviorism view of this. Like, hey, we can't see it, so we don't really care about it. We're going to pretend like it doesn't even exist. And that just really wasn't enough. So I started looking, in my own, I always try to set aside time each day and each week to kind of read things that I'm not very familiar with. So I started looking specifically at this, and it took some getting, it took some effort to find the work of Doug Greer and verbal behavior developmental theory. And at first, I didn't really jump all into the theory. I looked at one component that they call speaker is own listener behavior. And I really started, leaning into that. And as I looked, and Dr. Greer has published an enormous amount of very powerful and impressive data, I said, I think this is it. And I started to think, okay, we have to figure out methodologies to start shaping these up. And we all know that this is a private behavior we all experience. Like if you go to the grocery store and you forgot your list, you just don't go, well, shoot, I guess I'm going to have to come back when I have my list. No, you remember, you engage in speaker's own listener behavior. You have a conversation with yourself and you get home with most of the items that were on your list, and you may have forgotten one or two things. If you you and I can remember a time before GPS, if you had been to a place a couple of times, but it wasn't really fluent, and you remembering how to get there, you may talk yourself through. Oh, here's the McDonald's, and I know the next red light, I take a left. These are speakers' own listener behaviors, and I really started to find a lot of promise in that area. And I was setting up some trainings for my team, and we had the Von Barnes Holmes come in, and she did a wonderful job. And she recommended that I reach out to Doug and let me know that Doug and Dermot Barnes Holmes, Yvonne's husband, had been collaborating some recently. And this is in early 2023 that I'm talking to her about this. Well, lo and behold, that same year, the article that you just referenced that has Dermot and Doug both on them comes out in JAB. And no matter where you fall on the fence, and even if you don't deal with verbal behavior on a daily basis in your work, you can't help but feel encouraged when you read this article, because it's not an article of we're right, you're wrong, this is the way to do it. It's really a collaborative piece to say, hey, we all recognize that we probably have much less of this puzzle put together than we think. And so let's compare. And what I took away from the article was, wow, there are a lot of commonalities, many different terms, but they're describing very similar phenomenons. And what I loved about it is relational frame theory had much more of the conceptual framework established, whereas VBDT, Dr. Greer is working in and directing what was once the Fred Keller schools. So that he's doing work in schools where they have to have evidence of effectiveness. So what I found with VBDT is they had scores and scores of empirically validated treatment protocols for all the way through. And so it really validated to me what I was feeling about 5 years ago, which was, hey, this is a great clinical model, but it needs to improve. It needs to get better. And I decided that the way it needed to get better was to incorporate what we've learned from Dr. Greer and all of his colleagues' work with VBDT, not come in and have my people learn all these new different tools, but to take what I feel like VBDT does is it puts a very nice structure around the things, the concepts that RFT discusses. Also, I was trained very heavily in developmental psychology, and I really felt like, and you and I talked about this on the phone, I feel like that's been lost on how newer behavior analysts are trained. And it, in kind of central to VBDT is this idea of verbal behavior developmental cusps, and how we see a clear sequence of behaviors that emerge as if cusps. And so I decided that when I took this caseload over, not only was I going to kind of do this as a prove it to my team, but if I'm going to ask people to do a revised version of a clinical model that I've been refining for 15 years, I'm going to be the first one to do it, because I did not want it to be the case that, hey, this clinical model, well, I did like version 1.0 and you're doing version 4.0, but I'm like OG old school with this. No, so I launched it, and I really started thinking about how am I selecting targets. I was kind of the classic, hey, if the kid doesn't have vocal speech, let's make sure we have very aggressive programming around manding, because the idea of being, hey, manding is the first vocal operant or verbal operant that emerges. It's not the first vocal operant that emerges, though. If you want to say that the crying of an infant is a mand, I'm with you. But as I've heard some folks in the VBT camp speak before, do we really want to say that that's truly the first precursor to vocal speech? No, and having a 13-month-old in my house now has also been confirmatory to me as well. They imitate, they start to babble, and then they start to echo. Like, actually, VBDT call that parroting, because it doesn't even seem to need the social reinforcement that will come with an echoic. When my son says, if I say a word, or my son says a word, if I say it back to him, he thinks it's hilarious. And if he says a word, or if I say a word and he says it back to me, for whatever reason, he thinks that's hilarious, and he'll sit there imitating words with me for an hour if I have the time for it. And so we really kind of took that verbal developmental cusp approach to kind of whatever version of my clinical model this is. And lo and behold, the day I started and took over a caseload, I also had a brand new client, a 2-year-old, and a couple of other younger clients starting out. And so I said, okay, we're just going to dive in. And one of the things that's talked about in VBDT is how much time typically developing children spend as listeners before they become speakers. And so I thought about this. I've raged against what I call robo ABA, where we use all these little short snippet phrases with learners and, oh, good job, friend, and all these little. So I kind of flipped the script on our staff. I said, here's what we're going to do. He's not speaking right now. So at these periods of time and throughout the day, we're going to flood him with what is called in the VBDT camp, the naming experience. So I had RBTs taking data on their behavior of labeling, naming, tacting, whatever you want to call it, objects, items, people, other things in the environment. They had goals for depending on the length of their session. And what we found is within 2 weeks, I felt like I've had a pretty good track record getting kids with no vocal speech to start talking, but I've never seen anything like the couple of kids that we've had go through these methodologies. They are not only speaking, they're now speaking in multiple word utterances, very clear, I kind of went through the whole phase earlier in my career where it's like, let's get the partial vocalization and then we'll shape it into the full vocalization. Maybe we'll collaborate with speech a little bit and see what we can do. Maybe there's an articulation problem. Well, these two kids, for both of them, about 10 days into that naming experience, just started repeating what the therapists were saying. And now I actually went in. So then you are also very focused on their orienting behavior, which I was already doing, rapport building, but a very heavy emphasis early on. If they're not showing generalized imitation, to get that going as quickly as possible. So I've done that with both of these clients, and for the first couple of targets, it was rough, but it's now starting to generalize. And now I launched vocal imitation for both of them, and I'm like, well, this is pointless. They're already saying whole words, so they mastered out of this really quickly. And for now, that's about the depth I've gotten into the integration, because of course, a 2-year-old, we're not doing RFT programming with him just yet, but it's really taking that developmental structure and saying, hey, I'm, in one of Doug's papers, I remember him referring to teach the child an indicating response, focus on your echoics, vocal imitation, parenting, whatever you want to call it. Maybe teach them a pointing response to indicate things they want or need, but don't make a big emphasis at the front end, because from the cusp standpoint, that's something that emerges later on. And sure enough, this is probably going for both of these clients. I went ahead this week and launched vocal manding programs with them, and baseline's 100% independent so far for both of them. And these are both kids that weren't speaking during their first assessment, and it took us a little bit of time to get them into services because of insurance and all that. So they were not, and so in that period of time, we didn't see them start speaking. So I'm very excited. Once I kind of move out of this day-to-day case management role, I hope to reconnect with Doug and have him provide some training and maybe some consultation for what we're doing to get us a little bit more robust in the integration of the two. But on top of that, it also allowed me to implement some changes to how I introduce RFT programming to children. And that was based off of Yvonne's work, where they've found a clear order in which you should introduce these relational frames. And so I've done that with some of my 4-year-old clients. And now clients who 2 to 3 months ago were making moderate but not super impressive progress are now, I think that their next authorization may be their last before we're ready to discharge them. We're now able to serve them in groups more effectively. I didn't go through, if you remember, I've talked often about when you start getting into the arbitrary world in RFT programming, you get kids that will just refuse. No, those aren't the same. That's stupid. Or they just won't respond. Since I've switched to grouping the frames in the order that Yvonne's research suggests, I've not really had to fight that quite as much.
Okay, before we get too far,
it's been really nice.
That sounds awesome, and I want to backtrack because I think you went over something pretty quickly, and I think a lot of listeners will be like, hey, I want to hear more about that. So let's get back to the naming experience and flooding or at least what sounds like flooding the client with language, if you will, in terms of labeling stuff in the environment. Very specifically, walk us through how that or what that looks like. I know this is an audio medium, but what does it look like in the session itself? Is it both in terms of what they're doing? Do you guys have rates of labeling things that the therapists are trying to shoot for? So I'd like to get a little bit more granularity on that.
It's cumulative totals depending on the length of their session because of scheduling. Sometimes they may have an hour session and maybe a 3.5-hour session. So basically what we're shooting for is not quite a naming experience per minute. It's 25 per every 30 minutes of therapy time, whether that's at a table, whether that's in naturalistic environmental setting. It also goes in tandem with what we call our initial orienting behavior protocol, which is an attempt to build stimulus control around the command look. And so before we really fully launch the naming experience, because orienting becomes first in this sequence of cusps, we really do a lot of work around it. It's work that most people have done. So we'll take a highly preferred item, we'll simultaneously put it in front of the child's face while telling them to look. As soon as they've oriented to the stimulus, they get that item. And then we gradually back that up to where it eventually will become they have to do so many trials. But we're really trying to, rather than use their name, which has a lot of weak stimulus control around it. Parents say the name hundreds of times with no follow through. Once we see that, hey, okay, we're moving off of phase one, which is looking at a reinforcing item, no big surprise there that most kids will do it. Then we incorporate the look into, we're going around the sensory gym. Look, it's a blue ball, and look, have the learner orient to what it is the therapist is, looking at, and say, look, I see a green leaf falling from a tree outside, or look, you're playing with a yellow duck. So it can also be folded into your rapport building activities as well. If a child is, we have one of the favorite toys here for many of our kids is marble run. You build a big tower and you run the marbles down it. And it might be things like, while they're describing what the client is doing as a rapport building, look, you took a piece of purple tube and you put it on the green tube. See, purple and green, all the while making sure the learner is orienting to that. And so we give them that target of 25 per 30 minutes, which most of them vastly exceed that, which I tell them is fine. But it has to come with the learners orienting. If I'm labeling something like, oh, look, I see a pink elephant in the corner of the room, and they're all engrossed in watching monster truck videos, that's likely not going to have much of an impact. So it's a combination of the naming with, and again, I arbitrarily, quite honestly, picked a number because I couldn't really find like how much. So I tried to think like, what would a great parent likely do if they were at a park with their kid? How much naming and labeling would happen in that experience? I set that, but it also has to come contingent on we've already started seeing improvements in the child's orienting behavior. And when those things have happened, it's and what's so funny is we started with our 2-year-old. The therapist that had him in the afternoon say, hey, I think I just heard the little guy say something, but I wasn't expecting it, so I'm not sure, because we had nothing. We were collecting data on vocal speech, but we had nothing for 10 days. And sure enough, the next morning I had that caregiver for caregiver training, and she started like openly weeping. And I was like, what, man, what's wrong? She goes, my son started talking to me last night.
Wow.
I was like, okay. She said, he told me that my cup was blue. I said, what exactly did he say? He says, I was drinking from my cup, and he came up and pointed to it and said, blue, mommy. And which was his first, I guess, official words that anyone actually. And so the next day, I logged in and I looked at I was supervising another client. I just looked on his data just out of curiosity. And sure enough, in his first hour session, he had been recorded with 24 independent full vocalizations. And so then, of course, me being still old school, I was like, okay, break out the paper data. I want everybody writing down every single word he's saying. And after about 3 days and a stack of papers about like this, I was like, okay, the kid's talking now. So this is quite great. I feel very much like I did in the early days of implementing RFT. I was nervous. I was not very, I had some reservations just because it was new and I'd not done it before. And now I see this is a good nervous energy, because what will happen now is these clients will inform us to now say, okay, for the next set of clients, not only we're going to do this in a way that hopefully we can disseminate, but more importantly, it's going to inform us in making better decisions on how to choose these targets down the road. Like I just randomly picked 25 for every 30 minutes, 50 an hour. Well, I mean, I don't know if that's enough, too much, just right. It's, kind of like the three bears tasting the porridge, and now we can use our data to make better decisions. But at first, those words were simply repeating what we had been labeling, but it since then for both kids have mushroomed into all sorts of things.
That's fascinating, and there's some examples that are cited in that paper as well, where I think more in the context of instruction in a school setting, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, yes.
But
VBDT has a very precise metric that they use. I think it's called learning units, learning. I think it's very, very precise. And I've not quite gotten that sophisticated, nor have I made the determination if I'm going to incorporate all or this, because I really feel like what we've been doing for the last decade or more has been very, very good work. I do think this is a way, especially with our younger learners, to make it better. But you're right. It's if you look up Dr. Greer's work, it is quite impressive. Some of the things that they've published and protocols on things that you didn't even know that there were protocols for.
mm. And I'll link to that paper in the show notes of this episode if people want to check it out. And yeah, so it was really interesting. And again, it was really interesting, as I said a few minutes ago, to me. And even though I don't really, more of my work is school consultation with language, kids with lots of language, and sometimes that's the repertoire understudy, if you will. But it fascinated me just as, someone who's interested in behavior analysis more generally. So I definitely recommend checking that out. And another thing that piqued my interest, again, just from a curiosity standpoint, is the research possibilities with this. And, to your point earlier about, is 25 per, 30 minutes enough? Are there opportunities for, some sort of parametric analyses as it relates to the rate of labeling in this naming experience type of paradigm? And, do you get better outcomes if you double that rate or something like that? Or are there iatrogenic outcomes because you turn kids into they start tacting things in a very bizarre way or something like that? So there's all sorts of questions that come to mind, which leads
Absolutely.
me to my next question. Once you get a little bit more, I guess, flexibility in your day-to-day responsibilities, do you have any designs on doing some clinical research and trying to share that in a journal or something like that?
Absolutely. Client-oriented research is something I've talked about on the show before, and I've talked about in many of the places where I've gone to speak. I think that's really important. In medicine, there's not this kind of here, we're the researchers, you're the practitioners. In medicine, I remember my general practitioner in Atlanta had just published a paper on something they found, some phenomenon in their clinic that had really not, and that makes a lot of sense to me. We're the ones on the ground doing this work every day without the luxury of great experimental control. So I think there's so many practical questions. I think obviously looking more in depth right now, once we kind of get over the initial glee of seeing this naming experience and just the power that for these two kids it's had, well, is that something we can expect with all early learners? And, at first, I think it's from a clinical standpoint, your low hanging fruit is efficacy, like showing that something works. And then, sometimes those parametric or component analyses, whatever it may be, can be a little tougher to do clinically, but I'm definitely interested. I haven't had time yet to reach out. There's a very large ABA training program just down the road from me at Arizona State. I hope to eventually reach out to that faculty to maybe do some tandem work to say, hey, this is what we're seeing clinically. Maybe you can go and get us a more pristine view of like in a more controlled setting, and then we can then hammer it down. One of the things that I had started in Atlanta that I'm continuing here is a clinical replication of Alice Schillensberg's rapport building and demand fading paper from behavior modification in 2019. I just yesterday submitted a revision that was long overdue to behavior analysis in practice that was basically a practitioner's guide to, like, when you're using peak, you get the equivalents and the transformation books, and they can be overwhelming. Well, The DT, the direct training manual, feels a little bit more familiar because it's a lot of your VB-MAP ABLES kind of programming. And we show them a strategy where you can assess initial symmetrical derived relational responses just within the DT curriculum, and then how you can go about, because if the child doesn't give you a basic symmetrical derived relational response, the sooner you can fix that, the better for the child. And so that hopefully the reviewers will like our revisions, and it was accepted pending revisions. So hopefully that paper will be coming out. Always, I think staff training is valuable and much needed. The BACB requirements for training RBTs changes in 2026. So I'm looking to position ourselves here to hopefully be on the front lines of saying, hey, here's a great yet efficient way to do that. But yeah, I think also right now it's a whole lot of, okay, now we're piloting. We're piloting new orders of teaching relational frames. We're piloting almost like a new sequence of treatment goals based on verbal developmental cusps. We're piloting naming experience, our orienting protocols, all of those things. And in my career from that, usually, I've actually had a few pilots that just the stars aligned and we didn't have any problems, and we were able to publish those, because I still try to do it in a minimal design, usually a multiple baseline. But from that, I expect that we will have quite a number of topics. But that naming experience has really piqued my interest the most, just because I've never seen a protocol work so quickly and so powerfully for multiple children.
Awesome. This is all really exciting stuff, Jim. So I appreciate you taking time out of your day. That sounds even busier than it was the last time we checked in on the podcast to listen on what you're doing. You're always to something really interesting. And so I'm grateful that you're here to share it with us. If people want to touch base with you and say, hey, this sounds awesome, how do I learn more about this? How can, or people are interested in Therapy Matters and say, hey, this sounds like a cool place to check out. What would be a good place? How can people reach out and get and learn more?
I'm finding that the easiest way to get in contact with me on a large scale is through LinkedIn. Okay. James Moore is my LinkedIn profile name. Therapy Matters also has a LinkedIn. I'm one of the administrators for that. So if they have trouble finding me, Therapy Matters is pretty easy to find. You can send a message and I'll get an email conversation going with you. therapymatters.org is our website. And yeah, I'd love to hear from folks, and anyone who, I could do another episode about, Arizona is nothing like most people think it is. It's literally the most beautiful place I've ever lived in my life. And so if there's anybody out there that's like, all that work sounds great, but Arizona, let's have a conversation. Maybe you want to take the trek that I did and come on out here and be on the front lines of this new work.
Awesome. All right. We'll have all of those links to the LinkedIn, the Therapy Matters, et cetera, in the show notes for today's episode. So, Jim, thanks for joining me again.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.